Well, first, thanks to the BITAS and ATD and the Singapore Computer Society and everybody who's worked hard to get this conference going. As Alicia said, I'm Paul. I have been. So, am I? Sorry, Zoom is giving me a weird message. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Okay,
great. Yeah, I'm sorry. Zoom said it. Zoom was telling me that it quit, and I was like, "Well, no, it didn't." So, anyway, so I have 30 minutes, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so fast. So you'll notice that the title of my presentation is different than what was on the program, and that is because I want to talk to you about the opportunities and challenges in the architecture. And one of them, and we're going to talk about, is this notion of EA, past and present and future, and the opportunities and challenges. And the opportunity is to stop calling it EA and start calling it architecture practices. Now, the reason this becomes very, very important as we move into the art and science of designing and delivering valuable technology strategy. This becomes really important in the changes that we've seen in the actual profession itself. So why do we start calling it AP instead of EA? Well, partly because architects that deliver on value. In fact, it's not involved.
Paul, we are losing you for a few seconds.
It's going to be one of those, I think, with technical difficulties. So hopefully I'll try to be concise and move quickly and to deal with it.
You might need to reshare your slides. We can't see your slides anymore.
I will do so again. All right. How are we doing there?
Okay. Great. We can see you. Yeah, we can see your slides.
All right. So again, the goal of architecture is its fundamental purpose, the art and science of designing, delivering valuable technology strategy. Now, some of you might say, oh, well, that's EA. But then some EAs will say, oh, but this is about designing the enterprise. Well, you can't have it both ways. You either get to be in charge and lead digital transformation, or you can go be an enterprise designer. And this is a very hot topic, and you'll hear me argue this with Chris Potts and Wolfgang Goebel and a whole bunch of others who've written books on enterprise architecture, including Jeannie Ross from MIT. The objectives of an architecture practice are very, very different. It is to increase the value of digital outcomes and decrease the cost of delivery, decrease the time to deliver value by managing decisions at velocity with shared assets and under a competency model, while decreasing role confusion and increasing collaboration. This will reduce the cost of hiring overall, turnover, and increase satisfaction in digital investments. That's what the real goal of architecture practices are. What this ends up looking like, and the reason why I make this statement, is in some sense, and again, these graphs are not to size, this is the actual makeup of the world's architect population. The vast majority of architects in the world are titled software and solution architects. Then the others are infrastructure and or cloud architects, information architects, and then notice the smaller populations of enterprise and business architects. So what we keep trying to do is wrap this title EA around all of these people and make them into the same size chunks. But that actually doesn't work. It doesn't work because software and solution architects don't want to be called enterprise architects. So it's very, very important that we start, and I know this sounds semantic, but it actually fixes things. So we work with very large enterprises to get their entire architecture practice to work. And it is just these slight changes in wording and purpose that fundamentally alter the practice. Now, there's some more depth that, of course, we're going to go into, but this is one of those critical things that if you're currently an EA, keep in mind, every time we use that term, we alienate an infrastructure architect or a software architect or a solution architect in a way that makes them feel like they are somehow lesser. And I'll show you why in just a second. There are a lot of architecture forces at play, right? So that at the center of this, we have government agencies, we have banks, we have other things. We're being impacted by trends and hype, by location, by region, and mostly by supplier after supplier after supplier, right? So some of our members work on multi-billion-dollar projects. Some of them work on $100,000 projects. But each of the suppliers and vendors in the world come at us with a fundamentally different language of architecture. And what emerges from this, because we have not used a shared body of knowledge other than things like TOGAF, which is not a body of knowledge, it's a framework. And there's differences there. But what comes out of this is the confusion and chaos that we currently see. So these forces have shown us that this top-down role system doesn't actually work. If you actually look at the data, systems that are based on top-down role architects, meaning enterprise architects, domain and business architects, and then solution and software and application architects at the bottom, actually fail at the top. So about every 2 to 3 years, a system like this, outside of government agencies, which take longer, every 2 to 3 years, a system based on this hierarchy will actually have the head cut off. The top, the EAs will be dispersed, and then about 2 to 3 years later, they'll come back and reemerge. And we see this wave pattern because of some very significant difficulties with this model. One, coverage only goes so far. You cannot architect an enterprise. It is not possible for one human being to understand the complexities of an enterprise, no matter what models you have. Two, it creates hierarchy without creating competency. So what we end up doing is treating EAs as if they are business focused, and software architects and solution architects as if they are technology focused. And what happens when you do that is they actually become different kinds of people, and they don't get along, and they don't work together well. When in fact, what we have found with digital transformation and with digital advantage is that you need the business skills at the solution level as much as you need them at the enterprise. You basically need to make sure, much like in hospitals, that all the architects have delivery and strategy in their blood, in their purpose. Strategy to execution is the fundamental goal of all architects, whether they be top-level architects or just brand new. What we learn from hospitals is that chief architects still see patients, chief of medicine, chief of surgery. They still see patients. They're still a part of making it happen. Management and medicine are actually separated. CEOs cannot promote someone to surgeon. And this is important because I'm working with an organization right now that literally just promoted 1,500 engineers and gave them the architect title. So that's kind of like saying, hey, you're a pretty good nurse. I think I'm going to make you the head of surgery. It doesn't work. Career paths have to be rigorous and experience-based, and promotions have to come from mentors, people who are actually architects themselves. This creates a bottom-up momentum in digital transformation. Value is at delivery. Remember, it doesn't matter what you wrote on a business model canvas if you came out with something else that didn't look like what was on that business model canvas. It doesn't matter what your strategy is if your execution doesn't match it. And that means your expertise at business technology strategy, at technology value, at transformation has to be at delivery as much as it is in strategy. Instead, what we've seen in the past is by sticking with this wording that we have, this architecting the enterprise wording and trying to cover everything, we've gotten pressed out of delivery from the agile teams and out of strategy because we're seen as technologists. Instead, what we're doing is focusing now on having this responsibility and competency model control our advantage. And we're actually moving from a vertically managed architecture practice to a horizontally managed one. And what this means is that we use a competency model to promote architects instead of a management model. So in the organizations, we have very, very large organizations, including huge hospitals, banks, et cetera, that have moved and or moving to this competency model. Basically, it means that you can only advance in your architect career if your mentor identifies and sees you demonstrating these competencies. So managers lose the ability to just promote. And instead, you have a strong competency model that allows you to do that. And what that allows us to do is to actually cover more of the enterprise and what we call value stream architecture. And value stream architecture means that we organize architects across a value stream, with business and solution architects forming the core of the value stream strategy, all the way from the moment ideas come up in business units, using capability-based management in a horizontal flow. Specialists, of course, still exist, information, software, infrastructure architects, but we also integrate our SI and our vendor community architects into this value flow. And what happens with this is then chief architect's responsibility becomes mentoring and leading based off of real metrics that are generated by the actual architecture practice. And notice that the vast majority of architects, again, matching the data that actually exists in the world, the vast majority of architects actually exist then in the value streams of the business. And this form of architecture practice is actually your greatest opportunity to transform what you do now into something that works over long periods of time. To do this, you have to be fundamentally driven by an engagement model. Now, an engagement model is the total effort and structure of an architecture practice, including all the places where architecture happens. The BITAS is a body of knowledge that's derived working architecture practices around the world. And what it does is it allows us to build an architecture practice, not just an EA. And this is a very powerful model. What it does is it gets the entire architecture practice focused on what we call the IBAM, or imagine the digital customer, become a digital business, achieve a digital employee, and then maximize digital operations. Now, many of you in the audience or many of you listening will know that the vast majority of us work at the bottom left of this corner, maximizing digital operations. We're working on things like DevOps or security or reliability or resilience or some new application upgrades or things of that nature. However, the power of digital advantage is in the other three areas. Now, COVID has taught us to a certain extent how to collaborate digitally. However, what we really get out of the digital employee is not just different ways of collaborating. It's absolutely a fundamentally different culture. So in one of the recent examples of our mentoring program, where we work with large groups of architects to mentor them through this process, they're working with a large bank. This is a very, very old school bank. They're not used to thinking digitally. So one of their biggest challenges isn't just to get people using Teams or Zoom. It's to actually get them to fundamentally change their banking culture into a digital bank. And that means that you've got to get your employees to understand the difference between a digital business model and a traditional business model. You've got to understand who your customer is, right? One of the pictures they have is a whole bunch of sort of older people standing outside of a bank teller and waiting to get their cash for the week, instead of the new customer, which wants to pay with their watch, right? I don't even carry cash anymore in the Netherlands, right? I don't barely ever carry cash except for emergency purposes. IBAM then is this outcome model based on what we call digital advantage. It includes things like continuous innovation, continuous transformation, utilization, and measurement. And within this BITAS is all the tools and all the practices of an architecture, a working architecture practice, all of the techniques they use. So if you'll notice, it's got things like an outcome model, which is all about measurements. It's got an operating model, which is all about the work of an architecture practice. Again, regardless of whether you're a solution architect or an enterprise architect, the operating model is the things that the practice has to do. It has a value model, which is how we know things like technical debt versus structure and complexity versus value streams and measurements and analyzing architecture for its technical excellence. It has a people model, and we're one of the few organizations that have an actual full people model. How do you staff an architecture? How do you create community, job descriptions, competency models, organizational structures, deal with an extended team? So all of these things are fundamental to the BITAS, and they're all driven out of a set of research last 3 to 5 years. What happens then is that we start to achieve these, what we call ADA, but it's architecture-driven digital advantage. We've seen this work not only at end user companies, but actually we have a number of the largest vendors in the world switching to this model for their account teams, because they're finding that using these BITAS techniques, they actually deliver more stable results to their clients. And it includes, what is your innovation lifecycle? How do you invest in programs and products? How do you use capabilities to manage transitions between one operating state model and another? What kind of value management techniques do you use, and are you using them stably across the enterprise? Do you focus on operation? And then do you take all of that and feed that into better architecture practices? Now, notice that we say architecture-driven, not necessarily architecture-led. This is not about architects being everything to everyone. It is about architects driving this advantage. It means understanding the life cycles of an organization, right? Innovation, strategy, planning, transition and measurement, decommissioning, and really building an inclusive amount of coverage into your architecture practice so that you can work within these life cycles. It also means understanding what we call healthy tension. A lot of people try to make architects into the people that help everybody get along. What we have found is the companies that transform the most successfully are where architects are change agents. And change is not necessarily a comfortable feeling. So architects become very good at dealing with what we call healthy tension. Healthy tension means, yes, there's tension. Yes, there's stress, but we actually encourage a kind of stressful solutions where not everybody gets everything they want, but everybody gets everything they need. And so we pull on each other to create this tension. It also allows us to put a good line between engineering and architecture in a way that engineering becomes just as important as architecture, but it is not architecture. Meaning the whole notion of the team as the architect actually does not seem to work well in practice. The competencies are actually more important. And this allows us to make really powerful decision management tools where effectively we wait until the last responsible moment to make decisions. So this means that architects are actually involved in the solution, involved in the delivery. We're proactive, not reactive. We're not governance focused. We're actually out there building skyscrapers and cathedrals. And that means that we can wait until that last responsible moment when we have the most information necessary. At ISA in the BITAS, we use a thing called the structured canvas approach, which actually connects all these concepts together for the first time in the world and in a completely open source way. All these canvases, all these tools are completely open source for non-commercial use. So if you're a government agency, you're a business, you can use or even a vendor, you can use these things internally for free. They're all ready to go. We actually are hosting this in GitHub. You can actually go edit the articles yourself and do a pull request, and you can change the BITAS. We understand maturity as it's then applied to the outcome model. And what does that mean? That means that if you look at the BITAS, you'll see basically you have two externally facing two groups of externally facing zones: the digital customer and the digital business model. And then you actually have two groups of internally facing zones: digital employees and digital operations. And what happens as we look at maturity is we start to understand these zones in terms of how we impact them as architects. So we actually can measure your organization against these maturity zones and tell you how well you'll compete. We can also help you develop, using these components of the operating model, a value model, et cetera, a set of practices that will allow you to mature your zones. And that means that what we do a lot with organizations is we effectively help them build and grow their people first, right? Because this is all about people. Aaron likes to say, it doesn't matter what you make your kitchen look like. First you have to make a chef, right? You can have the best kitchen in the world, but if you put somebody who doesn't know how to cook in it, all they're probably going to do is burn themselves or cut themselves on something, right? So again, the grow your people is the number one piece: the competency model, the training, the assessments. Then there is a practice model: sharing, culture, responsibility. Then there are roles, titles, career. There's deliverables, requirements, decisions, design. All of these things now are reasonably well known in terms of how to do them and how to create them in a way that will work for your organization. As you do that, you adapt, you select teams according to customer needs. You get better at assignment and engagement orchestration. You get participation out of what we call co-opetition or multi-provider projects. So when you think about your projects, you might realize that you have Deloitte and EY and KPMG and a local provider. You might have Microsoft and Amazon and Google, all in the same providing the same functionality in different parts of your organization. What happens when you do this model is all of those people start to have to speak the same language, because effectively career path titles and level mapping all become the same. They all become based in exactly the way you expect professionals to do it. And that means that the business and enterprise and solution architects actually become owners, what we would call technical product owners in some language, but effectively they become owners of outcomes as opposed to doers of models. So when you hear people talk about modeling the enterprise and designing the enterprise and all that stuff, it really doesn't work. We've been at it for 30 years. I would love to say it did, because what you're in fact doing is you're designing in an ecosystem. And what that means is, if any of you have ever been gardeners or been to a jungle or been outside of your house, an ecosystem cannot be designed. You can design inside an ecosystem, but you have to be very careful, because if you do it wrong, you end up with a desert. In addition, it allows design to emerge, but architecture becomes proven. And these are kind of my top 10 rules for how to run an EA or an architecture practice. Let design emerge, but make sure architect is proven. That means that you measure it. And you measure it regularly. Many of you will have heard of OKRs and objective key results and KPIs and things of that nature. But again, the same thing holds, is anyone can design, but not all designs are equal. Architects then and the architecture practice are able to hold these competing mindsets in their brains at the same time, meaning we're able to look at trade-offs, at multiple things being right. There is no right, there is no wrong. There are just directions that are better through measurements than other directions. Quality attributes become business concerns: security, reliability, resiliency. These become business outcomes and not just the concern of the CTO or the CIO. Remember that architecture practices don't get certainty. We get comfortable with uncertainty. And that's one of the hardest parts for architects to grow into. In addition, we don't ever talk about minimum viable product. We only talk about minimum valuable products, because the only thing we care about is creating value for the enterprise. And if you can't measure it, it's not valuable. It's also not just making friends. This is about rigorous stakeholder management. A great architecture practice knows exactly who its stakeholders are, and they have a plan for every single one of them. Using stakeholder management tools that are common knowledge, but connected in the BITAS, you can actually manage any size group of stakeholders in an active way. And let me just end by saying, stop trying to implement frameworks. Get an engagement model. Stop trying to build an EA practice and start building an architecture practice. An architecture practice is inclusive. It includes business architects, information architects, infrastructure architects, software architects, solution architects. There's all sorts of us out there. Somebody cataloged recently that there's 140 or 150 architect titles out there listed on like monster.com or something. Now, while I think that's silly, because there's really only about 5 or 6 types of us, the truth is the engagement model will bring your language together. And that I did in 30 minutes. Somehow. I think Alicia's quite surprised. I never hit my time mark.
Thanks, Paul, for your sharing. I think it's a good update from what we last heard in last year for the BITAS itself. And if anyone have any questions for Paul, please put down there in the Q&A box. I think there are a couple of questions that is posted on the chat box. I think one is from Ravinda Kumar saying that how does architect get a growth if they follow the path of horizontal, and what is the future of architect?
Well, so I mean, this is an easy one. We are more in demand than we have ever been in the history. I've done this for 20 years. I started ISA as a professional association in 2002. There are more jobs for architects today than I have ever seen, and more demand. The future of architecture is very bright. My estimation is that we are about 5 to 10% of the total number of architects the world needs in terms of titled architects. Now, that may be kind of low. We may be closer to 20%. But my guesstimate, and this is really, really not good math, but it is the best measure that I can come up with, is that we need about at least 8 times the number of architects we have today. How do architects get growth if they follow horizontal? This is not about growth as an architect. As an architect, you get growth by practicing the competencies in the competency model. The horizontal growth coverage. And you can read the scope and coverage article in the BITAS to understand that better. I don't have time in the depth that it needs. But vertical or horizontal alignment, vertical as opposed to vertical, you don't get coverage because you end up with one person trying to cover too many. It doesn't work. It would be like saying one doctor for the entire hospital, right? It just doesn't work. You can't be a doctor for a hospital. Same process for us. You have to get more architects to get the coverage you need. I'm hoping that we'll hear more about ISA Singapore and joining, but we'll let Alicia and ISA Singapore answer that.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And for those of you who are keen with ISA, you can Google it. You can go to the ISA Global website, ISA Global itself, or you can, if you are interested in the local activities, you can go to ISA Asia Pac website. So just Google on it. So ISA Global, I think the moderator will key onto the chat box as well as the APAC website address. So you can always join. There is plenty of activities, events that is happening around.
There's a really interesting, Alicia, I don't mean to interrupt. There's a really interesting question here that I was hoping that we could talk about. How does the engagement model architecture practice work together with the framework model that we heard? Is this controversial? I don't know what framework model you heard earlier, probably something to do with TOGAF or FIAF or the ATD model or some of those kinds of things. So it's a really interesting question. I think it's something we probably should have a panel discussion on at some point. For people at, for Asia Pac, because we talk about this a lot. Frameworks are prescriptive. Frameworks are about do this, do that, do this, do that. So, so SAFE is a framework that is prescriptive for scaled agile. An architecture practice model is based on understanding how to do each of the items well. Right? An architecture practice model. So a framework will say, for example, TOGAF in the center says something about effectively requirements, user stories, the epics, whatever you want to call it, in the center of the TOGAF circle. It is a framework model. But what it doesn't tell you is how to do architecturally significant requirements well at different points of scope in that area. So the difference between the practice model is about how you organize people, how you do capability models, how you do each of these items well. It actually underlies and underpins a framework. So what you see with things like TOGAF is everybody downloads TOGAF, but nobody actually uses it, right? So it's something like 5 to 10% of the companies that download it actually use it because it's prescriptive. It tells you what to do and do it this and then do it this way. What the practice model says is, here's a set of things you need to be able to do well. Use this one, use that one. It doesn't matter. So the BITAS, for example, you don't have to implement the whole BITAS. You can just take one item and do that one item. So it's really important to understand that the BITAS actually supports things like FIAF and DODAF and MODAF and TOGAF. And, there's 20 odd frameworks in the world. There's something like 30 frameworks in the world, 30 or 40. Every vendor has their own framework, et cetera. The BITAS is actually a body of knowledge that lives under that and actually supports those things so that you're just actually implementing those in the way that the Open Group says you should do it, or the Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework says you should do it. Someone without an ICT background that wants to be an enterprise architect, another good question. We actually have a product manager to architect career path, or effectively a business person to architect career path. But keep in mind, you will have to get technical skills. If you're not willing to get technical skills, just don't do it. You'll make a bad architect. Just like I always tell developers, if you're not willing to get business skills, don't go there because you're going to make a bad architect. So keep in mind, we're not picking on you, but that shared business and technology capability in an architect is what makes the core of our profession. So there are some ways to do this, and you can do it on your own. I highly suggest getting a group, and I'm happy to talk to you about that separately.